Um, our speaker this morning, uh, coming to us from Ontario, is Tom Yoder Neufeld. And I'm going to read an introduction that was prepared by John Bender. If Tom Yoder Neufeld were in a debate with you, you'd be advised to have your wits and facts about you, every jot and tittle. If you were a New Testament scholar, you'd revel in talking shop with Tom. If you were a pastor, you'd draw rich sermon guidance from his work. If you were a student, you'd push yourself to write a fine paper. If you were a person in the pew, you would not nod off. I'm not sure which of those categories you're in, so if you're a member of a Sojourner's class at College Mennonite Church or following online, you're in for an enriching encounter. That's John Bender, first met Tom in 1967 as a student at Mennonite Brethren Bible College and College of Arts in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Tom was born in Winnipeg and grew up in German-speaking Europe, where his parents were involved in church ministry. He graduated from the University of Manitoba with a BA with honors in history. He studied at Harvard Divinity School, earning an MDiv there. Thereafter, he was involved in ministry with Native Canadians in Winnipeg, in prison and hospital chaplaincy, and with pastoring a Mennonite congregation in the northern mining town of Thompson, Manitoba, close to where polar bears roam. After Thompson, he spent an intense year at Associated Mennonite Biblical Seminaries, where fortuitously he met his wife-to-be Rebecca Yoder. And yes, she is the daughter of John Howard Yoder. In 1980, he returned to Harvard Divinity School, and in 1983 began teaching New Testament and peace studies at Conrad Grebel University College, an affiliate of Waterloo University. Rebecca and Tom were married in 1983 in the AMBS chapel. Tom finished his doctorate in theology program at Harvard in 1989 and returned to the faculty of Conrad Grebel College, including as Director of Graduate Theological Studies. In 2025, he will conclude his term as chair of the Faith and Life Commission of Mennonite World Conference. Tom wrote the Believer's Church Bible commentary on Ephesians, dedicated it to his parents, quote, "To my parents Abe and Irene Neufeld, always well dressed in the armor of God," an image taken from the end of the letter. His first love in retirement remains teaching and preaching. Singing and watercolor painting are also part of his pleasure indulgence. Tom and Rebecca are parents of two children, Miriam and David. They're members of First Mennonite Church, Kitchener, Ontario. Welcome to Sojourners, Tom. We appreciate you taking time to be with us and tell us a little more about yourself as you engage your first topic, creating unity, the church as junk art. It's
Well,
all yours.
yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate the very generous introduction that John Bender put together. It's nice that he's not there for me to see me embarrassed by all these accolades. Um, I'm really quite appreciative of the invitation to be with you and to talk about the letter to the Ephesians. Uh, you should know that you are part of at least a half a dozen congregations that in this past year have asked me to uh, uh, introduce the letter or to speak on the letter or to help them formulate a series on the letter. It seems to be that Ephesians has sort of found its moment in time at this point. For many years, It was neglected. I remember I've spent many years on this letter, and I must say I've weathered a lot of, both in reading and in conversations, a lot of very negative responses to the letter. A lot of people have taken, uh, I'm thinking of fellow scholars now who don't like the overwrought language. Some of you who are blessed with not knowing Greek are spared that because the translators have typically broken up long, long, convoluted sentences into manageable bits and pieces with periods and commas in place. Um, for instance, chapter one is essentially two long sentences. Um, which make it very difficult for translators to sort of figure out sometimes where to put the commas, where to put the periods. So that's one reason why some people have preferred some of Paul's other letters that seem to be just a little livelier and more immediate. But one of the stones of stumbling in the last years has been the so-called household code or the Haustafel. That is the instructions given to wives and husbands, children and parents, slaves and slave masters. And maybe just share with you the fact that one person refused to be my advisor for my dissertation because she did not want to have her name associated with the letter to the Ephesians, even though the household code was not going to be the focus of my work. So I'm familiar with the resistance to it, but I'm also heartened by the recent interest, also among us as Mennonites, in this letter. And I think the reason is that it has um, a remarkably well-developed vision that it expresses about the church and the nature of the church as it relates to God's peacemaking, you might say, with humanity and with the world. And so, in a time in which we're struggling, I know you and south of the border certainly are, and we are also in Canada, with enormous polarization, with conflict, with clashing of realities where people just can't seem to find a way even of knowing how to converse with each other across these divides. This letter speaks powerfully to that. And so I just wanted to give that as a background. For me, my many years of involvement with this has not bred, what's the word? Familiarity breeds contempt. My appreciation for this letter has only increased. And I hope to be able to communicate a little bit of that with you. Um, let me give you a minute of just background to this letter. A lot of scholars suspect that Ephesians may come from fairly late in the first century, written in Paul's name rather than by Paul's hand. Um, Written by close collaborators of his who wanted to make sure that his voice, the gospel that God had given him, would continue to be heard as the early Christian communities were developing. Now, if that's correct, which personally I suspect it is, then it was written in a time of tensions and where divisions were growing, struggles over who Christ is, how we should think of Jesus as the Messiah, as divine, what salvation means. Does it relate to something we now have, or is it related to something that comes only in the future? Um, Remember, this was a time in which the first generation of leaders like Paul, Peter, James, John, etc., were passing or had passed from the scene, and there was not yet a New Testament to sort of settle these debates. So you can imagine there's enormous uh, pressure uh, to to find out why we belong together. What does it mean for us to be together, especially in the churches of Paul, where, if you remember, Paul's big mission as a Jewish Pharisee was to bring good news, gospel, to non-Jews. That's an enormous, strange task to give a fierce persecutor of the Jesus followers. Um, so this tension, I mean, Paul seems to have succeeded. There were churches that came about, and they included Jews and non-Jews. We call them Gentiles. And uh, how are they going to live together with Jews with long histories of a spirituality, of a religious life that was intended to set them apart from Gentiles in how they eat, kosher eating, circumcision? All of those things were very important as identity shapers. And now in come these Gentiles, and Paul says they don't need to be Jews to be part of the people of God. Well, how are the Jews and the Gentiles going to walk together, which is the way in which Paul and his fellow Jews like to talk about what we might call discipleship, or what we call the Christian life. Walking together on the way would be as succinct a way of capturing the Christian life. Well, how do you walk together when you're so different from each other? So the reason I'm mentioning this as background is because I think it will help us to understand why this letter focuses so much on the question, do you know what the church is really all about? The church, by the way, the term church, I've really come to appreciate because it's a kind of mispronunciation of the Greek Kyriake. Do you hear the similarity? And that means that which is the Lord's, like the Lord's Supper or the Lord's Day. Church is God's project. And church is God's project to mend the divisions and to bring humanity together in Christ. That's the big vision that informs the letter to the Ephesians. So, small wonder that in our day, if you are involved at all in ecumenical discussions, or if you're involved in Mennonite World Conference, the letter that you go to as much as any other is the letter to the Ephesians, because its vision of the church is God's peace project by bringing together estranged and hostile humanity, reconciling humanity both to God's self, but also reconciling enemies and strangers to each other. That's the project of the church. Now, I've given a strange title here to you, um, which is the church as junk art. I want to show you two images before we go, and I'll see whether I can succeed at my screen sharing. Um, do you see that? Is that yes, I see on the screen that you can see that. Now, I want you to keep this image in mind because some years ago I was traveling with my family in southern Colorado, just a few miles from the New Mexico border, in a little town called Antonito, and we ran across this building. And it sort of blew me away. And almost instantly, I recognized this as an image of the church, not because of the towers, but because the creator of this strange structure that would be not allowed in Goshen, I'm sure. It would be considered an eyesore. But, Southern Colorado, there are very few people, and there are evidently all kinds of strange buildings. So this is one example of it. The constructor was a guy named Dominic Cano Espinosa. Cano Espinosa. He was a Native American Vietnam vet who survived the war. And in gratitude, he built this, what he called Jesus Castle, or let's call it Jesus Castle. I won't take the time to show you all kinds of bits and pieces of this, but it's an absolutely fascinating thing. What's important is that it's a multi-decade process in which he basically put this together with discarded materials. You can see that the windows aren't the same size. Old windows, 100,000 hubcaps. I'm not sure it's 100,000, but many, many hubcaps. Stuff he found along the side of the road. And he put this together into an homage to God's protective grace over his life. I find this to be an absolutely remarkable image. And it's an image of the church, in my view, of God's making a home for God's self out of the discarded materials of that others throw away, that is not deemed worth keeping. That's where God goes for building materials. So that's the one image I want you to keep in mind. The second one is this. I don't know whether any of you were in Asuncion for the Mennonite World Conference Assembly in 2009. I was working on a book that I had been asked to write on violence and the New Testament. And I've always been intrigued by the phrase in Ephesians chapter 2, where the cross is, in a sense, identified as Christ's act of murder, in which case he kills the hostility or the enmity through the cross. Now, what's of course the case, and everyone in the first century, when the Romans were still crucifying whom they deemed terrorists, does that sound familiar? When they were still doing that, Christ's cross became, ironically, a symbol not only of his having been murdered and executed, but of his overcoming, or God overcoming it through him on the cross, killing the hostility, the enmity that existed, that resulted in his death. Now, this crucifix, if you look carefully at it, let me show you a little bit of a close-up. If you look carefully at this image, you can see that the bits and pieces are pieces of metal, but they're held together by weapons, knives fashioned by prisoners in the state prison in Asuncion. And what's interesting about this is that the chaplain, Jonathan Beachy, some of you may know this person. For all I know, he's from Goshen. So you can raise your hands if you know Jonathan Beachy. He was a chaplain in the prison. And when prisoners came to faith, what did they do? They knew to bring the means of that have been either used in violent acts or in protection. They knew to bring them to the chaplain, and he saved them up, and then went at some point went to a very famous Paraguayan sculptor by the name of Hermann Gugiari, himself not a believer, but as a non-believer, he understood something about this irony of the cross, this irony of implements of violence being made into a symbol of the extent to which God goes to make peace with humanity. And so he fashioned these knives into, some of them still had blood on them, fashioned them into this aesthetic piece. It's another form of junk art. And we might say the cross represents for it represents God's creativity in taking even the means of human hostility and transforming them into the means of forgiveness, grace, and mercy. It's a remarkable image. I have to make this little aside here. I really am sorry that the cross is no longer part of our denominational logo, whether here in Canada or in the US. And that I understand that the designer found it too much of a negative thing. Well, it is that. It is one of the worst images you can have, but precisely because of that, it becomes an example of the extent to which God goes to make peace with humanity. The cross has always been an offensive thing. It should never be this beautiful thing. I mean, no one in the first century would have thought of hanging it around your neck or dangling from your ears or covering it in jewels or any of those things. It was horrible. It was intended, it was Roman state terror. So think of what it means in the first century for people like Paul and others to say, I preach nothing but Christ crucified, raised again from the dead, to be sure, but Christ crucified. That is so counter intuitive. Without thousands of years of having the cross on top of church steeples or as ornaments or as relics or as decorated focuses of worship, to proclaim Christ, the crucified one, as the one who is our peace, that is exactly where this image points to me. It's another example of God the junk artist, if I can put it that way. Well, let me walk through this chapter 2, a little bit with you, and we can see some of this at work. But I want you to have those two images, both this crucifix and this Jesus temple, if you like, this image of the church. I want you to have those in mind as we work together at this. Okay, let me invite you. I understand many of you have Bibles with you, and those of you who don't have no doubt memorized the letter to the Ephesians, so that I don't need to read it aloud and take the precious time that we have to do that. But I do want to point some things out. Go with me to chapter 2, right at the start. That again, we're sort of stepping into what is clearly a continuing of what happens in chapter 1, but we don't have time to explore the whole letter, which would be fantastic. But you should know, by the way, that I usually found even a whole semester's course too short to to deal adequately with the contents of this very dense and rich letter. Chapter 2 starts with a very dark depiction of humanity. Excuse me for a second. You who were dead in your trespasses and sins. By the way, this letter is quite consciously written by a Jew writing to a community of perhaps some Jews, but you might say mostly Gentiles. So the you here refers to Gentiles. This is Jews talking about you, the Gentiles, which includes all of us. We're the recipients of this. You who were dead in your trespasses and sins, in which you once walked, according to the eon of this world, your translations might vary. The ruler of the authority of the air, the spirit or wind, now the breath now at work among the sons and daughters of disobedience. In other words, this is humanity gone awry, gone astray. And then notice verse 3, among whom also we all once walked in the desires of our flesh. It's interesting, right? So you start off with saying, oh, let me talk to you, you Gentiles. And then very quickly, well, we too were part of that, you might say, humanity in the deepest possible trouble. And now I want you to notice something. Look at verse 4. But God. I can't think of, by the way, two words much more important than this. But God. Verses 1 through 3 are just a preamble to this, but God, who out of boundless love, a wealth, an overwhelming wealth of grace, brings us alive. Notice verse 5, brings us alive. That is, you Gentiles and us Jews, not just us Jews as God's historic people, but you are now part of God's people. So we are together made alive together with Christ. Do you see that? It's a very interesting phrase. We're entering Advent. Not long after Christmas, we'll be entering Lent and then Easter. And then we celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. Do you notice what's happening here? God, out of his grace and love and wealth, made us alive together. Together, that is, us Jews and Gentiles together, but together with Christ or through Christ, and raised us together, and then to take our breath away, seated us together in the heavenlies. I mean, this is writing to people who are clearly on the earth. So this heavenlies thing, some of you have in your translations heavenly places, in the heavens, etc. It's a way of including fallen, dead zombies together in the Easter event. This is very important because often our understandings of atonement, especially when focused on the cross, have Christ paying for us. I'm not wanting to take issue with that. But one of the classic ways in which atonement was understood, and we should think of there as being multiple ways of understanding that, is that of a rescue mission. Humanity is under the you might say, breathing the toxic air that is bringing death to them. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? In our time where we're becoming very conscious of climate change and the effect of pollution and the effect of contamination of our environment, and that we willingly participate in. We seem to be caught unable to find ways on our own out of this. So the but God is a very critical window here on the, you might say, on salvation as God's rescue mission for humanity imprisoned in alienation and estrangement. And God raises us up, makes us alive, and seats us with Christ, you might say, at the right hand of God. It should take our breath away. I don't want to, for a moment, think that we can fully understand what's being said here, except that it speaks to the degree to which God's intervention moves humanity from estrangement and death to life and proximity to God, along with Christ. There's a whole treasure box here of key terms. God who is rich in mercy in verse 4, with great love, verse 4, saved by grace. By the way, that's a phrase that shows up several times in verse 6, but then again in verse 8. By grace you have been saved. Sounds almost like a kind of Reformation slogan, doesn't it? Like somebody slipped that in there. We're saved by faith in verse 8. Question always is, and we're becoming more sensitive to that, whose faith are we talking about? I think clearly our faith is important. Our trust in God, our receptive trust in the gospel. But it also refers to God's keeping faith with us, Christ's faithfully giving his life for us. So when it says there we are saved by faith, please include God in the exercise of faith. In the Greek, the Greek term pistis means faith, but it also means trust, and it means faithfulness. It means keeping faith, somebody who is trustworthy. So God shows his faithfulness by taking ruined creation, junk, things that have been discarded, that have been left for dead, and taking those and fashioning them together. Now, with all that emphasis on grace, I need to keep tabs on time here. My understanding is, let me just check. My understanding is that you typically end sort of at 11:45. Is that right?
Right. Yes.
Okay, I will do my very best to do that, and maybe even allow for a question or two at the end. Notice that towards the end of this passage, where in verse 9, it's not our works. We're not saved by works, but we're saved by God's faithful grace. That's led to the Protestant heresy of pitting grace and works against each other. Notice verse 10. For we are his, I don't know what your translations have, but translations vary. The NRSV has, for we are what he has made us, created in Christ Jesus for good works. But let me just stay with this, for he has made us. The NIV, which many people use, has, we are God's workmanship. The Common English Bible, which has been used for the New Anabaptist Community Bible, has, we are God's accomplishment. Now, None of those, I think, fully capture the wonder of the thought that's going on here, because in the New Jerusalem Bible, it says we are God's work of art. Now that goes to my junk art imagery. God, the very bringing together of Jews and Gentiles through grace is God's work of art. It's God's new creation, taking wrecked creation and enlivening it. For what purpose? So that it can do good works. God's work of art comes alive by being able to do the good work that God has prepared for humanity to begin with. That's a remarkable fusion of grace with discipleship. Now, just a minute or two, let me show you in a sense, the crown jewel of this whole first half of the letter to the Ephesians, which, by the way, is organized like frames. We call it a chiastic structure. It starts in chapter 1 with blessing God and ends at this is the first half, which describes God's action. It ends at the end of chapter 3 with praising God. So those go together. Well, you can follow that principle of moving closer to the center. By the way, that's a very common ancient way of organizing something. You don't build towards a climax. You bring things through a set of frames, sometimes contrasting, sometimes echoing, all the way to the center where the important point is. So that's where we're at here. And take a look at this now. If you look at verses 12 and following, or 11, remember, you were without Christ, alienated, strangers, without hope, without God. You were atheists. So that's the negative Jewish stereotyping of Gentiles. If you look just on that principle of framing, look at verses 19 and following. You're no longer strangers and aliens. You are co-citizens. You are members of the household. You're built on the foundation. You're not only without God in the world, you are built together into God's home, built on the foundation of apostles and prophets, and Christ being the headstone or the cornerstone. That's a phenomenal image. And please remember Kano's castle, Kano's Jesus castle. Um, because you have to remember, you were once strangers, alienated, uh, rejected stuff, and now you are made into God's temple. It's sort of like God goes to the restore or goes to the landfill site to find the materials. And God's aesthetic is an aesthetic of grace. Speaking of God as artist, you take what's there, you take what's been rejected, and you make it new. You bring it alive. You give it something new. And that continues, by the way, the closer we get to the center. Verses 13, for instance, talks about Christ bringing the far near. Verses 17 and 18 echo that by talking about by talking about Christ as the evangelist of peace to the far and the near, an echo of Isaiah. And then in the middle, verses 14 to 16. That's, in a sense, the heart of the passage. And it's a remarkably dense poem. Many scholars, and I would include myself in that, think that this was a kind of peace hymn. Ironically, it's left relatively little marks on our hymnody. I don't quite understand that, because this is one of the greatest peace hymns, peace texts in the Bible. Um, He is our peace. That is, Christ is our peace, who has made both Jews and Gentiles into one, breaking down the dividing wall, the hostility in his own flesh, abolishing the law of commandments and regulations. We have to be really careful here when we read that, because this is not Christ abolishing the law, but Christ abolishing the law in its function of separating us Jews from you Gentiles. Circumcision becomes an issue. Kosher eating becomes an issue. All those things that were intended to separate, Christ overcomes that. And you can see it in the Gospels. He eats with sinners. Why does he do that? Well, who does the doctor go to? You go to the sick. I'm out there on the edges because God's project is to bring rejected elements into God's self through Christ, so that he might create the two in himself into one new human, making peace. And now the phrase that, in a sense, captures the image of that crucifix that I showed you, and might reconcile both in one body to God through the cross, killing the enmity thereby. That's a remarkable text. Um, One that we could spend a lot of time meditating on. And I would strongly urge you to read those verses 14 to 16 and reflect on them. And you can see in them an incredibly dense articulation of the heart of the gospel. God bringing us together and making us into a new human together with strangers and enemies. Now, let me conclude with this. I think this text, and as I've contemplated on for many, many years, challenges us as Anabaptists and as Mennonites, because we've often expressed our faithfulness, our passion for faithfulness, by separating ourselves from others. You're really trying hard to get it right when you distance yourself from those you think who aren't doing it as well. So the image of that, taken from chapter 5, the church without spot or wrinkle, that's been our ideal. Why haven't we seen that without spot or wrinkle is the end point that God's creative energy is leading to? But in the meantime, given the brokenness of humanity, the aesthetic of God is to bring art out of junk. God has delight in bringing together into one, into Christ, into a new human, estranged and hostile humanity. So that's a challenge for us. Let me turn it around. Some of us are so sick of the church without spot or wrinkle that we much prefer to be really honest about stains and wrinkles. And we forget that the point of the church is a transformation project. The church is the place where God is making new. And that's what I want us to focus on next week very strongly. That is, what does it take to live together in this new creation, in this new humanity in the church? And we'll have a chance to look at that next week. But I'm wondering whether there might be, and I know this has been really dense, and maybe I've exhausted you, but are there some observations, questions? I have as long as you have, but I'll let you cut it off when you think it's time.
Who wants to give a response or comment or question? I have been enjoying the junk art images personally, so I want to thank you for sharing those. Are there comments or questions that you'd like to give a feedback?
By the way, I should let you know that on a previous occasion, when I didn't call it junk art, but I talked about what God does with this, people started sending me examples of art made out of what other people throw away, and it's really quite wonderful. Everything from bottle caps to travel brochures that have been fashioned into marvelous works of art. To me, those are perfect examples of how we should imagine what the church is all about and how we live within that. So you're
Okay,
welcome to send me examples.
okay. Question here from Mark.
Thank you very much. I, I was curious in verses 6 through the start of 8, where it says, God raised us up with Christ and seated us with him in the heavenly realms of in Christ Jesus. Uh, and then the start of 8, for it is by grace you've been saved. Are we talking the afterlife here? Or how does this relate to on earth?
That's a fantastic question, and it's one that I sort of scratched my head on a lot, um, and tried to also understand how different commentators have tried to figure this one out. In my view, okay, this is my view. It's not the final word. Uh, in my view, the author is very aware and gives plenty of examples of indications that we are very much on earth. um, and that even as those who have been saved by grace, we are in the midst of a very difficult and turbulent existence, as we will see next week. So the Greek term there is the heavenlies, which your translation has the heavenly realms. Um, there are other ways in which that gets translated. I don't think it refers to being removed from the earth. It in this case, just like the kingdom of heaven doesn't mean the kingdom that is in heaven when we read in the Gospels, but it's the term heaven serves as a kind of euphemism for God. So in some translation, in some gospels, you prefer the kingdom of God. The very same thing Jesus says in one gospel is the kingdom of God, in another is the kingdom of heaven, or literally translated, the kingdom of the heavens. So heavens here represents the realm of God. So I think the author really does think that when we have been given new life in Christ, we are, in a sense, in the realm of God, being able to draw on God's power to engage the earthly life we are actually in. Is a real challenge for us, where discipleship, what we call discipleship in Mennonite circles, in Anabaptist theology, is often what we do with our lives, our bodies, our means, etc. It's very practical. Discipleship has to do with what we actually do in daily decision living. I think the author wants to say we better remember that we are sitting with Christ, so to speak, in those occasions. We've been saved and recreated for good works. In other words, we have we have the Spirit with us to actually practice the Christian life. So that's a challenge. That's a challenge for those of us who are very much impressed by our own capacities to do things. to realize that in the view of Ephesians, we are a product of God being recreated in order to do the right thing. So I don't think this is the afterlife. This is very much this life. I don't know whether that's a useful response to you, but that's my take on this.
Okay, one more comment. Retired professor of art, Abner Hirschberger. And what came to my mind immediately was a sculpture that he did made out of automobile bumpers and welded together.
No, thank you for your comments. I'm wondering what you make of Gordon D. Kaufman, Harvard professor, writing on in the beginning creativity. He doesn't say in the beginning God, but I think in the beginning creativity expresses perhaps humans of a contemporary life. I'm not quite sure how I feel about the use of God language today in the way that it may have had an impact in biblical times, but I'm not one to be talking about it. I'd like for you to speak to that question.
So, do we have another hour or two? Um, you've raised a number of critical questions. I have I have personally struggled with uh, Gordon Kaufman's recasting of God as creativity or as serendipity or many other things. I I almost feel like I have. We were together at the Boston Mennonite congregation, and we often argued with each other. Um, and I'm not sure that my arguments carried much weight with him. He was clearly the theologian. I was just a New Testament scholar. But and I have full respect for his efforts to try to understand God language in his context. I should tell you, however, that for instance, in my own congregation of First Mennonite Church in Kitchener, we have folks who are refugees from Eritrea, from South Sudan, from various countries in Latin America. We have members from all over the world who, for whom God language is immediately relevant to how they have experienced deliverance from mortal danger in many cases. So what they would do with creativity or serendipity, I don't know whom they would pray to. And I do remember Gordon saying he doesn't pray because how do you, in other words, for Gordon Kaufman, the issue was of a personal agent that just didn't fit his understanding. But it is absolutely essential to, as much as I empathize and deeply appreciate the probing thinking that Gordon Kaufman has given to this, I don't know how to live my Christian life without, in some ways, thinking of God as a gracious, loving agent. So it's not love is God, but God is love, if I can put it that way. Now, that's just my very quick response to your question, and I'm not sure it's at all adequate. It's a question I was not prepared for, but I appreciate its importance also for this letter and for whether this letter even begins to make sense. But that would be true not just for this letter, that would be true for all of the biblical literature. It's very difficult to know how you would translate biblical literature into the Bible into a kind of non-personalized agency understanding of God. So that's a quick response. I hope you come back next week.
Thank you, Tom. And let's give him our appreciation.
Thank you very much. I
We
appreciate
do
it.
invite all of you back. Remind me the title for next week.
The title for next week is
That's,
I have it here somewhere. Yes,
so do I.
it's preserving the unity, the church as chain gang.
Okay, we're going from junk art to chain gang.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Tom. And we look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you very much. It's been good to be here.